Something strange just happened in Washington. The Attorney General of the United States went on national television and started naming federal judges. Not people accused of breaking the law, federal judges. And the reason? Because they ruled against Donald Trump. Now think about that for a second. The top law enforcement official in the country, whose job is supposed to be defending the rule of law, went on TV and basically said 2 judges should be removed because their rulings didn't go the president's way. And if that sounds like the kind of thing that might cause a massive political firestorm, well, you'd be right. Because what happened next shows exactly why critics say this whole thing backfired instantly. But to understand how we got here, you actually have to start earlier in the day, inside Congress, where Pam Bondi was already having a very bad hearing. And when I say bad, I mean the kind of hearing where lawmakers are shouting, witnesses are interrupting each other, and the room starts feeling less like a congressional oversight meeting and more like a cable news debate that got completely out of control. And at the center of it all, Pam Bondi. Because lawmakers from both parties had questions about the Justice Department's handling of the Jeffrey Epstein files and whether the DOJ had really released everything Congress demanded. But the moment that really set the tone came early.
Here behind me is one example of an email from Epstein to a man whose name was redacted. The email reads, quote, "Where are you? Are you okay? I loved the torture video." Only after members of Congress demanded that we see the unredacted files did the world learn the name of this individual, Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem, the chairman and CEO of a company that had financial ties to President Trump's business and personal ties to Trump's advisor, Steve Bannon. Second, the survivors were not similarly protected, also in violation of the law. Here is another email titled Epstein Victim List. We have blurred the names of the survivors for their protection, but your Department of Justice initially released this list of 32 survivors' names with only one name redacted, along with numerous files that disclose not only the names, the emails, and the addresses of survivors, but also nude photographs and even the identities of Jane Does who had been protected for decades until your department released their names. Survivors are now telling us that their families are finding out for the first time that they were trafficked by Epstein. In their words, quote, "This release does not provide closure. It feels like a deliberate attempt to intimidate survivors, punish those who came forward, and reinforce the same culture of secrecy that allowed Epstein's crimes to continue for decades."
And that exchange tells you everything you need to know about the mood in the room. You've got survivors of Jeffrey Epstein sitting behind the Attorney General. You've got members of Congress demanding accountability. And instead of a calm back and forth about what happened, the hearing turns into a shouting match. Lawmakers accusing the Justice Department of mishandling transparency. Bondi accusing members of Congress of political theatrics. Interruptions. Reclaiming time. Gavel banging. At one point, it felt less like oversight and more like a political cage match. And then things got even more heated when the conversation shifted toward Donald Trump himself.
Mueller found no evidence, none, of foreign interference in 2016. Have you apologized to President Trump? Have you apologized to President Trump, all of you who participated in those impeachment hearings against Donald Trump? You all should be apologizing. You sit here and you attack the president, and I am not going to have it. I'm not going to put up with it.
You can let her filibuster all day long, but not on our watch. Not on our time. No way. And I told you about that, Attorney General, before you started.
You don't tell me.
Yeah, oh, I did tell you because we saw what you did in the Senate.
You're a lawyer. You're not even a lawyer. Within 40 minutes, you asked me a question. Within 40 minutes, Wexner's name was added back.
Within 40 minutes of me catching you red-handed.
Red-handed? There was one redaction out
where
of
he's
over
listed as a co-conspirator.
And we invited you in. This guy has Trump derangement syndrome. He needs to get,
Now stop and think about the optics of that moment. The Attorney General is supposed to represent the United States. not the personal legal defense team of a president. But critics watching that hearing said the tone sounded less like the nation's top prosecutor and more like a political surrogate. And the tension kept building. Because lawmakers weren't just asking about Trump, they were asking about the Epstein files, transparency, and why survivors say they still haven't been able to meet with the Justice Department. And that led to another moment that really raised eyebrows.
To the survivors in the room, if you are willing, please stand. And if you are willing, please raise your hands if you have still not been able to meet with this Department of Justice. Please know for the record that every single survivor has raised their hand. Attorney General Bondi, you apologized to the survivors in your opening statement for what they went through at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein. Will you turn to them now and apologize for what your Department of Justice has put them through with the absolutely unacceptable release of the Epstein files and their—
Every single one of them, hands up. Now imagine sitting in that hearing room. Survivors of one of the most notorious criminal networks in modern history raising their hands to say they still haven't gotten answers. Meanwhile, lawmakers are accusing the Justice Department of hiding documents. Republicans and Democrats both pressing Bondi for details. And the Attorney General insisting the department did everything it could. But if you thought that hearing was intense, it actually gets stranger after Bondi leaves Congress. Because instead of letting the situation cool down, she goes straight on television. And this is where the controversy explodes. During that interview, Bondi names two federal judges, Judge Beryl Howell, Judge James Boasberg, and she says they're biased political activists. Her argument? They ruled against Donald Trump. Now here's the thing. Disagreeing with a judge's ruling is completely normal in American law. That's why appeals courts exist. If you think a decision is wrong, you appeal it. That's literally the system. But calling for judges to be removed because they ruled against the president? That's a very different kind of statement. And critics immediately said Bondi had just made the situation worse. Because remember the context. Her Justice Department was already being accused of being too political, and her response was to publicly attack judges who ruled against the administration. Which, if you're trying to prove the DOJ is independent, might not be the best strategy. It's a little like being accused of yelling, and responding by yelling louder. And here's the bigger question that came out of that interview. What exactly counts as a fair ruling? Because if ruling against Trump means a judge is biased, what happens when a judge rules against the government, or against a Democrat, or against the next president? Are those judges biased too? Or is the only fair ruling the one that goes in the president's favor? That's the question critics started asking almost immediately. Because federal judges aren't supposed to swear loyalty to a president, they swear loyalty to the Constitution. And sometimes that means ruling against whoever happens to be in power at the moment. That's not a bug in the system, that's literally the design. But Bondi's comments opened up a bigger debate about something much deeper than just one case: judicial independence. Federal judges have lifetime appointments for a reason. The idea is simple. If judges had to worry about losing their jobs every time they ruled against the government, they wouldn't really be independent. They'd be political actors. And that's exactly what the founders were trying to avoid. Now here's where things get even more complicated. Because the cases involving Trump that Bondi referenced are still moving through the courts, which means they'll likely be appealed, reviewed by higher courts, possibly even the Supreme Court. In other words, the normal legal process is already underway. But instead of focusing on those appeals, Bondi went straight to national television and publicly criticized the judges themselves. And once that door opens, it's hard to close. Because imagine what happens if every administration starts doing the same thing. A Democratic president attacks judges who rule against them. A Republican president attacks judges who rule against them. Every controversial ruling becomes a political fight about the judge instead of the law. And suddenly, the courts start looking less like independent institutions and more like extensions of political power. That's the slippery slope critics are worried about. And they say Bondi may have stepped right onto it. Now, to be fair, supporters of the administration argue something different. They say judges sometimes do overstep. They say courts can become political too. and they argue that calling out judicial bias isn't automatically wrong. That debate has been happening in American politics for decades. But what made this moment unusual was who was making the argument. Not a political commentator, not a member of Congress, the Attorney General of the United States. The person whose department regularly argues cases in front of those same judges. Which is why some legal experts immediately raised another question. What happens when the Justice Department has to appear in court in front of judges the Attorney General just publicly attacked? That creates a pretty awkward situation, because federal courts depend on a certain level of institutional respect between branches of government. Not agreement, but respect. And when that relationship breaks down, things get messy fast. And this story is still developing. The judges Bondi named are still on the bench. Their cases are still moving forward. Appeals will still happen. And the courts will still do what courts do, review the law and issue rulings. But politically, the damage from that interview may already be done. Because instead of shifting the conversation away from the chaotic hearing in Congress, Bondi may have created an entirely new controversy. One about the independence of the judiciary, and whether the Justice Department is becoming too political. Which brings us back to the question at the center of all of this. If a judge rules against the president, does that automatically mean the judge is biased? Or does it just mean the court interpreted the law differently than the administration hoped? That's not just a legal debate, it's a constitutional one. And once it starts, it tends to get very big, very fast. Because in the United States, the entire system depends on three branches of government checking each other: Congress, the presidency, and the courts. Each one pushing back on the others when necessary. And sometimes, that pushback gets loud. Sometimes, it gets political. But the real test of the system isn't whether those conflicts happen. It's whether the institutions still function afterward. Right now, they are. The judges are still ruling. The courts are still hearing cases. And the appeals process is still moving forward. But the political fight around it, that's probably just getting started. And the next moves, from Congress, the courts, and the Justice Department, could determine whether this moment fades away or turns into a much bigger constitutional clash. Because once an attorney general starts publicly confronting federal judges, the ripple effects don't stop at one interview. They spread across the entire legal system. And the country ends up watching the same question play out again and again. Where exactly is the line between politics and the rule of law?